All right, welcome everyone. Hello. I'm Linda Sunnan, the Manager of Public Programs at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to our very first live virtual Lunch and Learn. Today's program, Confronting Hate, Responding to Anti-Asian Bias and Antisemitism During COVID-19, reflects the museum's founding principle: remember the past, transform the future. We do that through programs and initiatives that teach universal lessons that combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference. Today's gifted presenters, Dr. Lara Trubowitz and Andy Kang, are upstanders whose work exemplifies those values and principles. More about them in a moment. First, please take a moment to put your microphone on mute and turn your cameras off. That way, all of our attention gets focused on our presenters. Also, today's presentations, after that, there will be a live Q&A. We will be taking questions through our chat feature. In a second, I'm going to change my name so you see it. And if to chat, you hover over the mouse to see the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat icon and send questions directly to me, IHMEC, Linda Sunnan, privately. I will be sharing your questions during the Q&A portion of the program. We will get to as many questions as we can, but it's not possible to answer all of them. So we appreciate your patience and understanding on that. There are two presenters today. Our first presenter is Lara, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Then she will give her presentation. Then I'll come back and introduce Andy Kang in a more formal way, and then he will continue on. So without further ado, Dr. Lara Trubowitz is the Associate Director of ADL's National College and University Programs and Education Director for ADL Midwest Region. In these dual roles, she coordinates bias incident response and anti-bias diversity and equity training for colleges and universities, K-12 school districts and municipalities, focusing in particular on white nationalist trends. She came to ADL after having spent many years as a professor of English with expertise in 20th and 21st century anti-Semitism, racism, fascism, and neo-fascism. She has taught at many universities, including University of Iowa, University of California, Berkeley, Northwestern, and for the Prison University Project, a college degree program at San Quentin State Penitentiary in California. She has authored numerous articles and publications on a wide range of topics. And prior to the ADL, Laura worked with K-12 teachers, administrators, families, and students to create comprehensive anti-bias and equity curricula. She has also served as a restorative justice trainer with the Restorative School Communities Initiative, a partnership between the Evanston Police Youth Service Departments and District 65. It is really our honor to turn the program over to Dr. Lara Trubowitz.
Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your welcome and the opportunity to be here with all of you. We're going to now quickly, I'm going to pause for one moment to share my screen. We may have a few moments delay as I do that, so please be patient. All right. I am having, there we go. All right. I know that many of you are already familiar with ADL. We are an organization that has been around for close to 107 years. We were founded in 1913 with a twofold mission. It was to combat anti-Semitism and to work to protect the rights of the Jewish people. Our founders understood from the very beginning that if we were going to successfully work to combat anti-Semitism, we also had to be prepared to combat all forms of bias and discrimination. If we were going to work to protect the rights of the Jewish people, we needed to be prepared to protect the rights of all people. That twofold mission and understanding is at the heart today of all of the work that we do. We now call ourselves an anti-hate organization. We work again to combat anti-Semitism, bigotry, bias, and discrimination, extremism, which is where a lot of our attention is now focused, and cyber hate and harassment. We do that in 25 regional offices or through 25 regional offices with a headquarters in New York City. As Linda mentioned, I am, in addition to being the Associate Director of National College and University Programs, where I work with colleges and universities across the country, I'm also the Education Director for ADL Midwest. In the Midwest region, we cover Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. So we are a 6-state region. This is a quick slide to help you understand the kind of work that we're doing. We spend a lot of time under that first icon, investigate and research, tracking data. So looking at hate crimes. We run a yearly audit of anti-Semitic incidents. We also look at anti-Semitic attitudes. And I want for a few moments to focus on our most recent study that we call the Global 100, where we track across the globe changing anti-Semitic attitudes. In a few moments, I'm going to be talking about the kinds of rhetorics, anti-Semitic rhetoric that we are seeing in what we might call the COVID era. But before doing that, I thought that I would trace out the landscape, looking in particular at certain iterations of anti-Semitism that we saw commonly occur prior to COVID. In the Global 100 study, what we tend to do is we interview people by telephone. We survey in 100 countries across the globe. We conduct live telephone surveys. 2019, we sampled 53,000 people. We consider a survey significant, statistically significant, only if we have talked to or been in contact with at least somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people per country. This often means because of communications infrastructures that we tend to tap people in urban regions more than we do in rural regions. What we do in the global survey is we ask 11 questions. If we get affirmative answers to at least 6 of those questions, we say that somebody has demonstrated an anti-Semitic proclivity or propensity. We do not say that they are anti-Semitic, but rather, again, that they have demonstrated an anti-Semitic proclivity or propensity. In the United States, this past year in the 2019 survey, what we saw is 11% of our participants respond to 6 questions in the affirmative. Again, I'm going to go back to those questions briefly, just so you have a sense of what it is that we are asking. We say Jews are more loyal to Israel, so that's the dual loyalty issue. Jews have too much control over global affairs, number 5. Jump to number 8, Jews have too much control of the United States. So those are the kind of questions that we're looking at. In the United States this past year, 11% of the population surveyed answered at least in the affirmative to at least 6 of those questions. You can see in some ways we've got some good news here. If we look at the 1964 data, we saw that 30% of respondents answered in the affirmative to those questions. So we're now looking at a data point of 11%. Again, good news. But what we are paying attention to are the ways in the COVID era, some of the questions that we asked, some of the anti-Semitic attitudes that we saw are being now repackaged or repurposed. I want to focus in particular on some of the answers and some of the data points. 1, question of, are Jews more loyal to Israel than America? 24% of that 11% said yes. 15% of those surveyed said that Jews have too much power in the business world. 12% said the Jews only care about their own kind. 12% said the Jews are less honest business people. 11% Jews have too much power in the US today. 10% said that Jews use shady practices to get what they want. Again, we're going to see some of these attitudes repackaged or repurposed in the COVID era. Here are some of our very classic tropes, and you already can see some of these in play in those attitudes. So Jews are cheap and greedy. They are responsible for the death of Christ. Again, dual loyalty, power and control, the blood libel. So they are guilty of drinking the blood of Christian children. To this I would add, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, the rhetoric of disease. So Jews as a kind of virus. Now I'm going to start moving into our conversations about COVID and what we're seeing in the COVID era. But first I want to say this, that in many ways what we can argue is that anti-Semitism itself is an argument about Jews often used for political ends. So anti-Semitism itself is an argument about Jews often used to political ends. Some ways, in the rhetoric we're seeing, it is more that, an argument about Jews, rather than a sentiment or a belief. So what are we seeing? Let's focus for a moment on the idea that Jews are a virus. So much what we're seeing, especially online and especially within white supremacist and white nationalist propaganda, is this notion. It's one of the slides, two of the slides that have come across our desks. The first one, you'll see the notion that Jews are themselves a kind of self-replicating body. In the first slide, COVID-19, we have Jews viewed under a microscope, parasitic in nature. See them, the stereotypical Jewish face with the body of the virus, again, viewed under the microscope. Here we're seeing a kind of transition from the notion that Jews are in effect a kind of de facto host body, very science fiction-like idea, to the notion that Jews are themselves the entity that infects. And that's what we're seeing play in the next icon, the next image, the notion that Jews are a virus by nature, or, and here I use this word very intentionally, viral by nature. It is this trait that enables them to infiltrate secretly, that enables them in effect to deploy themselves. Again, when we're talking about the repackaging or the repurposing of very classic anti-Semitic stereotypes, we see that in the first image, this notion of the Jew as a parasite, right? The monstrous vermin, this is from a 1944 text, Der Stürmer. We've got the parasite who's crawling over the face of the earth. The text reads, "Thou shalt eat the nations of the earth." So in the slide now, it's one that has been updated with a kind of science tech. Here, I'm going to read this one because it's harder to see. The one on the left-hand side, again, updated with science tech and more modern vocabulary. Scientist is looking through the microscope and says, wow, this virus can lie dormant for weeks, earn the immune system's trust, then kill its host slowly. Truly terrifying. And then, of course, we have the face of the Jew under the microscope. We also, in the more contemporary era, however, have a notion of the Jew as profiting from the virus. So now the Jew is no longer the virus itself, but rather utilizes the virus for nefarious means. I'll briefly read the text. We have the Jew saying, of course, it's a real outbreak, just like SARS, bird flu, and all the other recent epidemics. You never hear about them anymore? Well, that's okay. We have other hoaxes planned. I meant epidemics. What? There was a coronavirus vaccine patent applied for before the outbreak? Nonsense. People are dying. We must get them vaccinated. Looks like a vaccine is available soon. Aren't you all so lucky, Goyim? Ha ha. So again, the notion of the Jews as now manufacturing not only the disease, but the cure. So really working with the desperation of a population and then charging for the thing that will cure the disease. These particular slides that I now have up here are coming from a whole series of white nationalist or white supremacist sites. This is the kind of language and ideas that they are exchanging with one another. The one that I'm going to point to is the one where we've got the hashtag on the right, the lower right, of Big Pharma. We've got create a vaccine program, create a virus, create a vaccine from the virus you just created, which doesn't cure anything. Release the virus. Use the media to promote the virus you have released. Promote the vaccine as the solution. Watch the people line up like sheep. You'll notice in the piece right above that text, reference to the idea that China stole the coronavirus from Canada. So the idea of the virus as a bioweapon, something that can now be weaponized. Then in the lower left-hand corner, we say, who made coronavirus? Was it the US, Israel, China? So the notion that the Jews are in control, puppet masters, they are developing not only the virus itself as a bioweapon, but as a cure, making the entire world dependent on this particular body. Again, this is a repurposing of an older rhetoric. So in the first image that we have the idea of the Jews as all powerful on the left-hand side. It was a political cartoon from 1898, which depicts a image of the Rothschild family, the Rothschilds with their hands surrounding the globe. We move to the more contemporary era, and we're seeing references to George Soros. Now, one media outlet has asked about George Soros's involvement in this flu panic. He is somewhere involved in this. Now, there are very real implications, consequences for this redeployment of rhetoric. Here's an image of a gentleman, Timothy Wilson, and I use the term gentleman very loosely. He was somebody who was part of a neo-Nazi organization, National Socialist Movement, recreated. He was eventually killed in a shootout with the FBI. He had planned, he created, gathered an arsenal of weapons, had been planning to attack a hospital that was serving COVID patients. He communicated extensively about his plans, again in the white nationalist sphere online, and you'll see what he says at the very bottom of his text. Jews have been playing the long game. We're the only ones standing in their way. So the idea of weaponizing, not only is this notion attached to Jews, or the idea that Jews themselves are weaponizing the virus, it is also something that is being talked about as something that can be employed to harm various populations, including the Jewish community. So again, the slide on the right-hand side, if you have the bug, give a hug, spread the flu to every Jew, Holocaust. On the left-hand side, if you get infected with coronavirus, go visit your local synagogue and hug as many Jews as possible. Cough on all the doorknobs, rails, pens. So again, the idea that this can be used as a weapon against Jews. I want to end with this particular slide before I share two slides that will give us some sense of what we can do about some of this or with this information. One, an older slide, which really plays on the idea of Jewish greed and Jewish power. The way of the Red Sea is a way of blood. This is a slide from 1944. Italian poster depicting grinning Jewish bankers carrying money bags past dead soldiers. Because we're in a moment going to transition to Andy's talk and begin to speak a little bit about how COVID rhetoric or COVID era rhetoric is impacting Asian American communities, Chinese American communities. I thought this would be a good slide to end with. Here we have an idea circulating where we have the two groups, stereotypical Jewish man and Jews as such, working either wittingly or unwittingly in cahoots with one another. It is China represented in this one stereotypical figure that spreads the disease, and this spreads it to the United States. The United States is infected. The United States then gives money to the Jew who will find, again, the cure. So I think one of the things we want to pay attention to is how anti-Semitic rhetoric is not in effect about, or to a large extent, not about Jews at all. It is about the dynamics of power and money. It floats, it is nimble, it can be attached to a whole variety of communities, bodies, and peoples. And it is for that reason that we need to work very closely with one another to support communities that are targeted by this rhetoric, because again, there are very real consequences. want to end with 2 slides to get us thinking a little bit about the kind of things we can do in response to this escalating rhetoric. One is that every social media outlet right now is working quite tirelessly to make sure they have a reporting apparatus online. We are working very closely with Zoom, for instance, to ensure that there are reporting apparatuses available to people who are, say, using Zoom for personal meetings as well as in the professional sphere. We have an incident reporting site, which I'm going to turn to in a moment. You can report any kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric and rhetorics of bias or bigotry of any form. You report it, you can report it anonymously or with as much information as you want, and we will start up an investigation. So that is one thing that is at your disposal. The slide that I have on the right-hand corner, something that went up in Evanston, it was quickly painted over. I think, again, it is crucial in this particular moment to make sure that each group is supporting other groups who are being targeted so that no group is standing alone. This rhetoric is targeting all of us. Here's a slide of our incident reporting apparatus. Again, it is available to anyone. You can go online, find it, report an incident, again, giving us as much information as you possibly can. One of the things that we do recommend highly is that you screenshot anything that you see so that we can begin an investigation. I want to end, and I would love to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Q&A, talk a little bit about how we can support our kids, because especially as they are moving more and more into the online space, their access to this kind of rhetoric is increasing. These are some resources that are at your disposal. I recommend not only the Books Matter lists, the book lists, but also the Table Talk for Families. Those are populated on a bi-weekly basis. They're conversation prompts that you can use with your kids to talk about some of the issues that are in the news. With that, I'm going to transition over to Andy. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Hi, this is Linda jumping back in. Thank you for that powerful and frankly disturbing presentation. And we look forward to during the Q&A when you are able to give us some tips and tools to use as we go forward. So thank you very much. For those of you who joined as the program was going on, please take a minute to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras so that all the attention will be on the program. And now it is my honor to introduce Andy Kang. Andy served as one of the, Andy is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago, where he leads the organization's efforts to achieve its mission to build power through collective advocacy and organizing to achieve racial equality and equity. Andy serves as one of the lead negotiators for the Illinois Trust Act and co-drafted a bill to institute automatic voter registration in Illinois. Both bills were signed into law in 2017. Andy co-led efforts to strengthen Chicago's welcoming city ordinance and expand language assistance for Korean voters within Chicago and suburban Cook County. He has also been a leader protecting voters' rights, formerly serving as the co-chair of the Just Democracy Illinois Coalition. Andy is a thought leader in the area of language access, participating in the City of Chicago's Office of New Americans Language Access Advisory Council, and worked with the State of Illinois' Language Access to Government Services Task Force. Andy sits on several boards and advisory panels, including the Korean American Bar Association, the board of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and co-chair of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association's Immigrants Committee. He was a member of the Committee on Equity, Equality, and Opportunity for Governor J.B. Pritzker's transition team in 2018-19. He also served as the Good Governance Committee for Mayor Lori Lightfoot's transition team. Additionally, He is a graduate of Leadership Greater Chicago's class of 2018. Andy received his JD from Northwestern University School of Law, where he was the chair of the Diversity Coalition and an active member of Asian Pacific American Law Students Association. And with that introduction, we are honored, Andy, to have you here, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for attending and your interest in this. I wish it was a better topic, but unfortunately it is one that we are going to have to, I think, wrestle with together for years to come. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So let me do this. I'm going to, full disclosure, not done a share screen yet, so this will be my first attempt here. So let's see how this goes. All right. All right. So Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, we have affiliates in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and L.A. Here in Chicago, our mission is to achieve racial equity, right? And that means not just justice, racial justice for Asian American community, but for everyone, right? We want to create a better society where there is no other and people aren't being targeted, unfortunately, in the ways that we're going to be talking about today. I should just mention, it occurred to me, and off the top of my head, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm reminded of 1999 shooting by a white nationalist, a neo-Nazi, that impacted us here in Illinois and Chicagoland, that took from us Northwestern basketball coach Ricky Birdsong, who was targeted. But I'm also remembering that 6 Orthodox Jews were shot during that same spree, as well as a Korean American man was murdered outside of a Korean American church. And it just reminds us all that this hate, while it is very organized, it is also directed at a broad swath of communities. And so, very much so, a very impactful book for me was Elie Wiesel's book. And the idea that if it's not your group being targeted specifically or talked about in this time of COVID, that maybe you don't have to worry about that. And I would argue that we all should be worried regardless of who's being targeted. So thank you for your interest in this subject matter. I'm going to start on a somewhat lighter note and kind of ease into the darker parts of our history, but there is a duality to the Asian American experience and how we are perceived in the mainstream public in America. And the first one is, when people oftentimes think of Asian Americans pre-pandemic, they think of Crazy Rich Asians, right? That's a very well-known movie. Or they think of doctors or academic achievement or people doing really well professionally in America, right? And certainly there is in the top 10% of the Asian American community a lot of success economically. One thing to note is our bottom 10% actually, we have the largest economic inequality and gap of any racial group. With our top 10 and our bottom 10. So while we do have crazy rich Asians and do have folks that are doctors and lawyers and engineers and whatnot, we also have a lot of folks that are struggling right now in the time of the pandemic, that they need rental assistance, they need cash assistance, and those tend to be the stories we don't hear about. I also note that you'll see in the bottom of the corner of this slide, people oftentimes have the wrong impression that Asian Americans are against affirmative action or issues that are other communities of color are trying to champion in the cause of racial justice. Statistically speaking, that's actually not true. Polling data has consistently shown that most Asian American sub-ethnicities support things like affirmative action. But there is a very loud, I would say, anti-racial justice voice that sometimes maybe distorts that impression. Why does the model minority stereotype exist? Why do we have that duality? And I'll get to the yellow peril and the issue that we're dealing with now, is what's called the wedge minority. So the idea of the model minority sprung forth roughly around the same time as the civil rights movement that was heating up. And you know, while there are explicit writings about this, the general consensus by most that have been following this phenomenon is that post-World War II, after the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and going into the civil rights movement, a lot of those in power were looking for an example of a minority group that was succeeding under the status quo system, meaning we don't have to change any laws. The civil rights movement is just rocking the boat. So who can we point to that is doing well and has succeeded despite a lot of race-based discriminatory laws? And that is why Asian Americans, you start to see a lot of stories about how successful, what good citizens Asian American community is, right? Now, to be sure, there are success stories and there is a lot of academic achievement to be proud of. But to, I think, Lara's earlier point, there are oftentimes to these narratives is very much a political motivation for why certain stories are getting elevated. And so that in itself has been damaging, not just to that bottom 10% that we talk about, that I mentioned, that is struggling, has issues of being undocumented, has issues of income, has issues of trauma, if we're talking about our refugee community coming from Southeast Asia and other places. That all gets covered up and those people become invisible as well, along with having an argument to other communities, let's say the African American community in particular, that the issue isn't the laws and hundreds of years of slavery and discrimination and Jim Crow. The issue is something inherent in that community, and that's why they're not succeeding the same way that Asian Americans are. And so it's something very, very harmful and very much disrupts any chance of racial unity and solidarity for those causes. But to Lara's segue to me, we are here to talk about how rhetoric and images are used politically and how they almost inevitably lead to violence and then government policies, right? That is the sequence of events if left unchallenged. And I'm going to start with one that some folks may be familiar with, but after there was a small infusion of Chinese labor, cheap Chinese labor in America, the population did start to swell a little bit, getting upwards of north of 10,000, including families. And as that happened, as the Transatlantic Railroad was created by these railroad workers, the Chinese community started to expand into mining, gold mining, coal mining, other jobs. They started having their own hubs of economic development, meaning small Chinatowns of a couple hundred people throughout the Northwest and Pacific coast. At the same time, there was a bit of an economic downturn. White workers were starting to struggle. The gold mining and mining industry was a bit in turmoil. And you started to see a lot more stories about the problem originating really not because the economy was doing bad, but because there were too many Chinese in the West and on the Pacific coast. And what you're looking at below is you're actually seeing a caricature from the mid to late 1800s. That is actually an Irishman and a Chinese person, right? So for those of you that are familiar with the Irish American story, they were not always considered white. They were oftentimes associated with the problems of immigration. At the same time, you saw a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric. You see this octopus symbol. The Chinese were not only blamed for cheap labor and undermining white workers, they are also associated with crime. They were associated with opium, which was, you know, as many of you who know anything about British and Chinese relations, opium was actually something that the British forced upon the Chinese, and then the Chinese brought to America, right? And then immorality and disease in particular, not just through the form of prostitution, but bringing diseases from overseas. What you see on the bottom, and this was actually quite common, are drawings that very much make light of or even praise violence against Chinese at the time. And that did manifest itself in a number of ways. In 1871, there's what's called the Chinese Massacre, happened in Los Angeles' Chinatown. It is still, by my count, I try to do a pretty exhaustive online search, the largest mass lynching in Americans' history. At least 17 to 20 individuals were lynched, some of whom were already killed and shot dead. But it all originated from one individual getting shot in Chinatown. And at that point, the entire neighborhood was attacked by over 500 individuals. In the Los Angeles area. In 1887 in Oregon, there was what's called the Chinese Massacre Cove. Over 30 Chinese gold miners were murdered and their bodies were found later downstream. In Tacoma, there was the riot of 1885 where the entire Chinatown, over 100 residents were forcibly evicted and put on train cars sent to Portland, Oregon. And so what you would see along the Pacific coast is not just individual hate incidents, but mass organized, oftentimes with political backing from elected officials, of violence against Chinese Americans. What that sort of critical mass of violence and anti-Chinese rhetoric and sentiment, what it actually led to, though, was official policies. And the most notable one is in 1882, what was passed was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this essentially forbid any immigration, full stop, no exceptions, from China. And it was the first time in US history that a specific ethnicity or nationality was singled out in that way, having a complete ban. Now, I think for many of us who are following current events, some of this may start to sound familiar, right? And so it's why I think this is a very important story that we talk about. You'll notice below, around all the other troubling rhetoric, is a political cartoon that literally says we should build a Chinese wall around the US. So to, I think, Lara's earlier point, what we're seeing is these are not new, racist political tactics to bolster support for individual or a movement or an idea. These ideas have been around for a very long time. I'm going to segue to another point in America's history that I believe many are probably more familiar with, and is the anti-Japanese sentiment after Pearl Harbor. One thing I do want to pause to say is even before Pearl Harbor, as the Chinese immigration was brought to a virtual halt by the Immigration Act of 1924, which really banned all immigration from Asia, Japanese Americans were finding more work, right? They were not Chinese, they found their ways into the country, and they were doing very well in the agricultural industry, in particular in the California and the West, and that was brewing a lot of resentment. It was so much so that by 1920, the California state legislature passed what's called the Alien Land Law, which forbid any Asian Americans, Japanese in particular, from owning land, which obviously makes it very hard to build a family farm and to pass that on to your children. So even pre-Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of resentment in the West Coast to be exploited. Post-Pearl Harbor, obviously there was a big opportunity to argue that Japanese Americans were national security threats, right? We got attacked, nobody saw it coming. You'll see a caricature down there. This was during the time leading up to Japanese American incarceration, saying that the fifth column was all Japanese Americans, whether they were US citizens or not, living on the West Coast, were just waiting. They were all sleeper cells waiting to be activated for Imperial Japan during World War II. What that led to, despite the utter complete lack of any evidence of spying or conspiring by Japanese American citizens, whether in Hawaii or even on the West Coast, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. This was the forced removal of over 120,000 Japanese American citizens from the West Coast. They were put on trains with nothing but what they could carry, and were put in incarceration camps from Idaho to Wyoming to other remote places. I should mention, you'll see this in the center of the slide, and I'm an American. That was a sign put up by a Japanese American store owner who was basically forced to sell his store because he You know, he could not own it. He could not maintain it. He was going to the camps. Many Japanese Americans had to sell their homes, their businesses, their farmlands, wholesale for like a fraction of the actual value, because the white folks that they were selling to knew that they had no leverage whatsoever and that they had to leave by X date. And so a lot of family fortunes were lost. A lot of Japanese Americans literally had nothing when they went into these camps. And just to wrap that one up, an apology only came in 1988 from President Ronald Reagan. Redress came in the form of $20,000 to only living individuals who were actually incarcerated during World War II. But just as a reminder, it took 40 years to even apologize for official government policy that destroyed lives for over 100,000 Japanese Americans. Getting a little more recent, in the late 70s, the Detroit auto industry was struggling. I bring this up example because while it didn't lead to official policies, it did lead to the murder of Vincent Chin. A lot of elected officials, business leaders in the auto industry were very, very hard in their rhetoric against Japan and Japanese automobiles and the impact on the American economy and the American worker. The reason I bring this up is I don't want this to be thought of as just a conservative ploy. In this instance, a lot of the elected officials and people that were saying these things about being anti-Japanese, they were Democrats in the Michigan area because they were getting a lot of pressure about the auto industry suffering. Vincent Chin, this for many Asian Americans, but for many of you may not have heard of this story. Vincent Chin was out celebrating a bachelor party. He was about to get married. He encountered two individuals, one of whom worked for Chrysler. A verbal altercation started, a fight ensued. After the fight, these two white individuals got a baseball bat, hunted down Vincent Chin, and beat him to death with a baseball bat. The reason this story resonates so much with the Asian American community, the two individuals were caught by the police and put on trial, and they were charged with manslaughter and fined, and they served no jail time. They were fined $3,000 for murdering Vincent. The federal case was botched by the federal prosecutor, so no time was served. And only subsequently, many, many years later, with a civil lawsuit, was any kind of small percentage of justice done. And so this story has persisted because many Asian Americans were shocked by it, but also by the wrinkle. While the impetus for this was anti-Japanese sentiment, Vincent was Chinese, and it didn't matter to the two individuals that murdered him, right? He looked Japanese, and that was enough, right? And so this is an important story for myself, am Korean American, for all Asian Americans, for all people who ever have had a history of being targeted. It's important for us to remember why it's so important that we stand up and speak out against these things. And then finally, just really quickly to wrap up, post 9/11, I think we all are very familiar with the last almost 20 years of anti-Muslim rhetoric and how that has led to not just violence and increase in hate incidents in a lot of Muslim, but also South Asian communities that again are confused sometimes as being Muslim, whether they're Sikh religious folks or otherwise. And how that has led to official government policy, again, whether it's the Muslim ban or other things that we're seeing around the country. Finally, just to close, I think many of us are familiar with the anti-Chinese rhetoric. I'm just going to bring up a few quick examples. The deeply troubling thing here is it's not just President Trump, it is the Republican Party, its leaders in the Senate, it's an entire news channel, albeit it is Fox, and I know people have different opinions about Fox News. A lot of people watch Fox News, right? And this is the information that they're getting. I will just end with, we're starting to see the government policy piece, right? Along with the hate incidents that we're seeing around our country and in Illinois, we're seeing now, again, a ban on immigration. And yes, it's under the pandemic, but Stephen Miller, who many of us are familiar with, a white nationalist sympathizer, if not a white nationalist himself, is in the White House, is the point person for immigration policy. And so 1924, I mentioned Immigration Act that banned all immigration. We're again now at a moment where, yes, because of the pandemic, but they are taking that opportunity to ban all immigration. And so just finally, the last thing I'll flag, that I wanted to end with some good news. One of the strategies that Advancing Justice is committed to, we've partnered with PBS. We're very proud to announce that on May 11th and May 12th, a 5-part Asian American history series called Asian Americans will be premiering. It's the first time that Asian American history is being presented by PBS. I've gotten a sneak peek. It's fantastic stuff. It's really important, not just for the Asian American community, to remember some of the stories and some of the narratives and trends and patterns that I've just laid out for many of you, but we want everyone to see this so that we can start connecting the dots, and rather than our communities being in silos, we can work together on this. So there will be a K through 12 curriculum, a school curriculum being put out by PBS and the folks associated in partnership with that effort. Our hope is that Illinois and Chicago and other places would consider adopting that curriculum, especially given our community is one of the fastest growing in the state and the city. So thank you. I look forward to the questions.
Oh, thank you, Andy, for sharing the history so that we have context as we go forward as to what is really showing up in our society right now. So I'd like to open up for questions. And once again, if you can do that by sending me, ILHMEC, Linda Sunnan, your questions in the chat box, and then we'll cover a few as we have time. But to begin with, Lara, you had a departure point ready from your talk about what do we do for our children, what they're hearing, what responses might be. And I'd like to add to that, if both you and Andy could also cover, so many of us are in Zoom meetings, Zoom classes, all sorts of online things. And there are many occasions, unfortunately, where tropes, the language, references are worked in, even sometimes by colleagues. And so how do we approach that both in social and workplace? What are your recommendations? That was one of the questions that came in. I'll turn it over to both of you.
Let me start very quickly with the issue of what we're calling Zoom bombing. In part, I want to start with that because that's what we as an organizing group started with when we first met before we came on today. The term is, in its vernacular, talked about as Zoom bombing. The more official term is video teleconferencing hijacking. And so that includes things like, some of you may have kids on Google Classrooms, Facebook. There are whole kinds of social media spaces that may be targeted by what we are unofficially calling Zoom bombing. I like the official term in part because what the term Zoom bombing suggests is that it is amateur in nature. It is directed by amateur groups, by individuals, maybe pranking us, trying to cause havoc, when in fact, although that exists, there's also a more there are more organized efforts to interrupt both personal calls on Zoom and in other arenas and professional gathering spaces. So in short, what Zoom bombing is, or video teleconferencing hijacking, is it's an attempt by an individual or a group to interrupt a meeting with images. Sometimes they can be things like genitalia, pictures of genitalia. Other times they can be much more radical in nature. We've gotten reports of people putting up signs of swastikas, KKK images. Sometimes they are designed to speak to other white nationalists in other spaces, some more coded language. If you are the target of Zoom bombing, one, I will say that we have a lot of resources about preventing Zoom bombing or video teleconferencing hijacking on ADL's website. But if you are the target of that, a few things that you can do. One is, if you are hosting a meeting, put on a co-host. That way you have more eyes on the screen, so to speak. If somebody does, well, let me backtrack. You can also set up a waiting room, which is what we did for this call. So people go into that waiting room as you would do in a physical space. They are then let in once the host can sort of check, hey, I know this particular person. You can do things like if somebody does come on, screenshot, always screenshot. After you've screenshot whatever has been put up, you can then kick them off, disable their account. So those are just some things that you can think about. Again, I encourage everybody to go to our website where we have more sort of tools for preventing Zoom bombing and video teleconferencing hijacking. We are working as an organization closely with Zoom and other organizations to get security protocols built into the Zoom space. So that's the Zoom world. In terms of kids, because so many of them now are more and more online, we know that they have access to some of this rhetoric in ways that they never did before. We want to normalize these conversations. So just as we're giving you some of this information, we think it is paramount that you give in an age-appropriate way your kids some of this information as well, so that they know what to look for, so that they're not surprised. They don't have to respond reactively in a moment of crisis. We want to normalize these conversations. As you're beginning to normalize some of these conversations, don't be surprised by some of the reactions that you might get. We've heard kids say things like, when they're starting to hear about the anti-Semitic rhetoric, I don't want to be a Jew anymore. I don't want to be Jewish. So you've got to do a little bit of your own emotional work. You've got to do a little bit more of your own information gathering, so you can prepare for comments that might otherwise take you back. The other thing that we recommend, and then I'll pass it off to Andy, is to practice scenarios. Give kids an opportunity to think through what they might do if something comes their way in a moment of e-learning, for instance. If an educator says something, if a fellow student says something that they've heard, that way, again, they are not being reactive. They are not having to perform in a moment of crisis. I have some other thoughts, but I'm going to pass it over to Andy on that note.
No, I think those are great pieces of advice. Actually, probably going to get on the website later today for ADL, make sure that we have those security precautions in place for the Zoom bombing. I will say, I just to reiterate the security, especially for sensitive subjects that you are promoting to the public, either via social or whatnot. One of our partners, Cambodian State Association of Illinois, had a Zoom event related to their Killing Fields Museum, which is the only one in the country. Unfortunately, they got Zoom bombed, and with quite obscene material, and it was very jarring for the participants. So please take that seriously, and I think whenever possible, if the guest list is coming through trusted partners, making sure that people know who these individuals are, especially if you're trying to have, a substantive conversation, and you're looking for chatter and interaction, and you're going to be opening up that option. If you're controlling it a little bit more, then you maybe have a little more flexibility about security. But yeah, no, those are all great ideas. I just say with our children and people in school, one of the things that we have been talking a lot in the Asian American community is the hate incidents, the bullying, the individual people getting verbally harassed, especially for kids, is actually much lower right now because of the shelter order. And what we expect is once if and when the shelter order is raised and kids are back in school and people are interacting more, that the hate incidents will actually spike in the next year or two, right? After we all know what the loss in life and economic damage is, there's going to be a lot of raw emotion for people to politically capitalize on that and turn it into hate, right? And so that's something we should all be ready for and bracing for together. We have a few ideas that we're hoping to launch in the very near future around bystander training and making that training more available readily throughout the community, regardless of your identity, right? So we can all be there for each other. But yeah, this is going to get rough. I reference post 9/11, my Muslim American colleagues that do similar work. I've been debriefing a lot with them about what to expect. And what they have told me is that do not expect this to go away in 6 to 9 months, that this is likely going to be around for several years.
Terrific. Okay, we have time just for one more question, and it is about federal law enforcement. It seems to many that the enforcement has been slow to match the increase in hate crimes, certainly before shelter in place took place. Do you know, what is your current take on the federal response and local response to these hate crimes?
I can go real fast, and I do want to actually hear what Lara has to say. You know, I think one of the challenges is speaking to trauma, a lot of victims of hate incidents aren't instantly thinking about law enforcement, right? It takes a while to process. But I should also mention, in particular with federal law enforcement, I mentioned our Muslim community, they have a very frayed relationship with the FBI because of a lot of surveillance programs that currently exist. I should also say for the larger Asian American community, about 1 in 10 in Illinois in our community is undocumented, right? And there's a lot of distrust about engaging the federal government in particular. So, you know, as far as hate crimes laws and protections, you know, I know Kim Foxx and the Illinois Attorney General, along with the DOJ, will be having an event locally for the Asian American community to let them folks know about their legal options. I should say, though, that we know if those laws and those protections on their own were going to fix this issue, then we all would not be talking today. And so I think there is a social, non-legal avenue for us to really step up in. And that's my hope, is that we would do so.
Yeah, I'll just quickly piggyback on Andy, what you already said, just to start off with the idea of trauma, which is such an important notion, something that we really have to think about. So we can set up all the security protocols that we want with Zoom bombing, but when it occurs, there is going to be a traumatic reaction. So we cannot spend all of our time focusing on the front end of the game, right? The security protocols. We also have to make sure we're talking about how to handle the debriefing moment, because those are essential moments to have space for conversations after or in the wake of a particular Zoom bombing attack. So I can't stress that enough, Andy. I think that's such an important point. In terms of the federal legislation, we know that there are 5 states currently that don't have federal hate crimes legislation on the books, including our neighbor Indiana. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to advocate for the passage of that hate crimes legislation. It is that legislation that allows law enforcement to be, or allocates resources for law enforcement agencies to be well trained on how to receive data, how to better understand why it is that communities might not want to report a hate crime. So that is essential. Gives them the resources for in turn taking those reports and then transmitting them to the FBI. Currently we have 92 cities across the nation with populations over 100,000 that do not have apparatuses for collecting hate crimes data. So yes, advocate for the passage of those laws, but then we have to ensure that they are effectively implemented and that there are supports for communities that might not want to readily come or easily come to a law enforcement agency to report. The social services are absolutely crucial. I saw somebody throw up in the chat the idea of voting, right? That is also key.
Unfortunately, I feel like this conversation could go on for a very long time. It was really both great learning and also appreciate the actions that we can take when presented with situations personally, but as well as how to prevent it and how to take action. So thank you both so very much for sharing your wisdom and your time with us today.